Here this morning, but we're Nehemiah week 15. I think, depending on how the discussion goes today, I may finish today, and then next week I'm going to do a wrap-up, some comparisons of stuff that Ted July got for me. We started into chapter 13 last week, and some of the discussion that we had at the very end was about the Amorites and the Edomites and the intermarriages and intermingling, and that was something that wasn't supposed to be done. And then Ted July brought up about, Ruth. If you go to Matthew, let's turn over to Matthew 1, where it's got the genealogy. It has the genealogy of Jesus, and in that genealogy, we have Ruth in there, and Ruth is a Moabite. And we're always talking about that they didn't want all this intermarriage and whatnot because we wanted that the bloodline had to be clean for the Israelites to get to the Messiah. And so Ted's question was, was it important that Ruth is in that line? Is that correct, Ted? Is that what you were bringing up? So I did all this research for nothing? No. Well, he brought it up. I wrote it down. So then I kind of got looking around, and kind of in the back of my mind, I had this thing that, okay, Jesus accepts everybody. And if you are a Gentile, they were able to become Christians. And so I looked some of this stuff up, and I think kind of the answer to his question, why was it important? I hope I get to the right part of it here, because I got a couple of different things here. Ruth was a Moabite. Her ancestry had its origin from the incest committed between Lot and his oldest daughter. And though the Moabites were related to the Israelites, so to speak, they were enemies because Moab had opposed Israel's advance toward Canaan. And the Moabites were not known to worship Yahweh. They were polytheistic pagans, occasionally offering human sacrifices to idols like Shamash. So as a result, God prohibited the Jews from intermingling and intermarrying with the Moabites. And that comes from Ezra 9, verses 10 through 12. Unless a Moabite renounced all that being a Moabite meant and became all that it meant to be a Jew. So in the fact that one of the books of the Old Covenant is named after a Moabite woman is itself a testimony that a miracle of God's grace had taken place. And it goes on, it says there's a great backstory in Ruth that makes things really interesting. Boaz, who became Ruth's redeemer husband, was the son of Rahab. From the biblical record, it appears that Boaz's father was Salmon and his mother was Rehab. Now, you remember who Rehab was? She was the prostitute that when they sent the spies into Canaan, she's the one that saved those guys' lives. And so then in return, when they invaded Canaan, her family got spared.
And she was not a Jew.
And she was not a Jew, that's correct. I was going to get to that, I think. And then it said, it says, but since biblical genealogies sometimes skip generations, it's possible that Rahab was Boaz's grandmother or even a great-grandmother. It may not have been the mother, but that's up to, anyway, they're related. It says, regardless, her maternal influence in Boaz's family would likely have had a similar effect on Boaz to the one, or a similar effect on Boaz. She was another non-Jewish woman, a Canaanite, and a former prostitute. She and her family were the only survivors of Israel's conquest of Jericho because she hid the Jewish spies and helped them escape. Let's see. And when you look at, Jesus is unashamed to have women of questionable repute in his family. In fact, he actually goes out of his way to point them out. In Jesus' genealogy, in Matthew, right here where I had just had you go to, the only fathers and sons are recorded, with notable exceptions, with 5 notable exceptions where mothers are also named. So in this lineage, if you read down through here, you see that both Ruth and Rahab make the list in Matthew 1:5. And so does Tamar in Matthew 1:3, who entered the royal bloodline by disguising herself as a harlot and seducing Judah to impregnate her because of the unjust way he treated her. Bathsheba, whom David stole from Uriah. Remember, Uriah was one of his soldiers. He had him killed, sent him to battle to get killed so that he could get his wife, Bathsheba. And of course, Bathsheba was the mother of, anybody remember? Solomon, correct. Okay. And Mary, Jesus' own mother, who became pregnant with Jesus outside of marriage and whose claim to miraculous conception was received by most. So the people tend to conceal the more disgraceful events of people in your family, but not Jesus. He chose to highlight possibly the 5 most scandalous women in his lineage. So, but I think what I really wanted to talk about here is that Ruth, I got to find the line I'm looking for here. Ruth demonstrated incredible virtue, as she pledged her loyalty to Naomi, that was her mother-in-law, and she acknowledged Yahweh as her God. So she gave up what she was as a Moabite and believed in Yahweh. And so I think, and Jesus did, to become a Christian, he accepted everybody if they went to his way. And I think that's kind of what you were trying to lead to. Okay.
There's several things that are important. I think we touched on pretty much all of them, at least the ones I can remember right now. The one I was thinking of at the time had to do with, there are hints and clues all over the Old Testament that has to do with the fact that it wasn't going to be just the Jews that were going to be in this new kingdom that was going to happen. And this right here is one of those clues for that.
Right.
And then, of course, the lineage, at least at Ruth's time, came through Boaz, I think, and Boaz was of course, from the tribe of Judah. He had to be, because Jesus actually came from the tribe of Judah.
Right.
But at the same time, now we have, in several cases, a Gentile at the same time, which shows us a lot about God's plan and stakeholders, what people think about sometimes about the Jews being so special that they can't do anything wrong. That's not true.
Yeah, they did a lot wrong.
Yeah.
Even though they were God's chosen people, they did things that upset God, and of course he.
Some of that on Wednesday night when we were talking on
So anyway, I think what the point that you brought up, because I hadn't really thought about it until when you brought it up last week. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else got any other comment about what I just talked about? Okay. All right, so last week we had read chapter 13, verses 4 through 9. I think I'm going to read them again. And then, because I had started into this section and we ran out of time. So 4 through 9, 13, 4 through 9, 4 through 9. It says, now before this, Elishab, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, and the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, meaning Nehemiah. No, I lost my place. I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king, and came to Jerusalem. And I then discovered that the evil that Elishab had done for Tobiah before Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. So that was where we had dropped off last week. Picking up from there, so all this happened while Nehemiah was away at the palace, which suggests that those he had appointed to lead in his absence had failed in their oversight. It doesn't take long for an enemy to capture leadership, and too often the people will blindly follow their leaders in the path of compromise and disobedience. It was bad enough that an Amorite was living in the temple and that a Jewish high priest had let him in. But this intruder was using a room dedicated to God for the storing of the offerings used by the Levites. He defiled the temple by his presence and robbed the servants of God at the same time. Nehemiah lost no time in throwing out both the man and his furniture, rededicating the room to the Lord and using it again for its intended purpose. Like our Lord, Nehemiah had to cleanse the temple, and it appears that he had to do it alone. Let's see. I'm going to pick up, let's see. No, I'm going to continue right here. Okay, so then verse 10, I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all Judah brought the tithes of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedadiah of the Levites as their assistants, Hanan the son of Zechar, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God for his service. In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold the food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them, and I said to them, "Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath holy. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and prepare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. So in this whole section right here, again, it was talking about they were not observing the Sabbath like they were supposed to, like they had promised they were going to back in a previous chapter, back in chapter 10, I think it was. So, and then now we move, and then in this next section we move into about who they marry and who they intermingle with. So, and then starting in 23, it says, "In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, 'You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves.' Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin." I'm going to stop right there. So in verse let's see. So we would not give our daughters and wives to the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons, was the promise the Jews had made to the Lord back in chapter 10, verse 30. But they did not keep it. In his survey of Jerusalem, Nehemiah saw women from Ashdod, as we just read, Ammon and Moab, married to Jewish men. And he heard their children speaking foreign language. foreign languages. A child is more likely to learn how to speak from his mother, with whom he spends more time, than from his father, who is away from home each day working. If these children did not know the language of Israel, how could they read the law or participate in holy services? If a generation was lost to the faith, what was the future of the nation of Israel? God's people and the people of the world can be identified by their speech. In 1 John chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, it says, "They are from the world and therefore speak from the viewpoint of the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God, and whoever knows God listens to us. But whoever is not from God does not listen to us. This is how we recognize the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood." So now Nehemiah dealt with the problem by first, he was horrified about what was taking place here, that such things would be done in Israel. In a similar situation, Ezra, back in Ezra chapter 9, remember he plucked his own hair from his beard when he got upset about what was going on. But Nehemiah plucked the hair of some of the offenders. Ezra had dissolved the mixed marriages in Ezra 10, but Nehemiah only rebuked the offenders and made the people promise they would not do it again. Nehemiah also delivered a sermon reminding the people that Solomon, one of Israel's greatest kings, was ruined by marrying foreign women. In Solomon's case, his mixed marriages were a threat to the throne and the kingdom. And in Nehemiah's day, mixed marriages even threatened the priesthood. The law of Moses was clear, but both the priests and the common people had deliberately disobeyed it. Nehemiah then purified the priests and made certain that only those who qualified served. However, the problem with the priests was not completely settled, for the prophet Malachi had to deal with disobedient priests in his day. And if you go over and read Malachi, you'll read about that. I read 10 through 14. I already did that. So, okay, so 10 through 14, that was, okay, I guess I got ahead of myself here. So, I see, I went, never mind. That's when he found out about the Levites weren't being taken care of, and he confronted the people. Okay. "We will not forsake the house of our God" was the final statement the Jews made in their covenant with the Lord in Nehemiah 10:39. This is when they made the promises that they were going to, or that covenant that they made. This meant paying the temple tax, providing wood for the altar, and bringing the required tithes and offerings to the priests and the Levites. Without the faithful support of the people, the ministry at the temple would languish, and the Levites would then scatter to the villages where they could work the land and survive. When Nehemiah had returned to the city, he discovered that the people had failed to keep that promise, which I had read there back when I first started this morning. The priests and the Levites were without support and were deserting their work in order to survive. The people ignored the warnings of Moses. In Deuteronomy 12:19, it says, "Take heed of yourself that you do not forsake the Levite for as long as you live in your land." And in Deuteronomy 14:27, I think it is, you shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. Nehemiah contented with them, which means he rebuked the leaders for breaking their promise and disobeying the law. Before his survey of the city was completed, he also rebuked the nobles of Judah and the men married to the foreign women. What word am I referring to? Just a second. Okay, the temple officers in charge of the gifts had forsaken their posts because there was nothing coming in or going out. So Nehemiah set them in their place. He stationed them at their posts. He then saw to it that the people brought to God the offerings that rightfully belonged to him. He appointed 4 men to supervise the treasury and distribute the tithes and offerings. These men represented the priests, Levites, scribes, and laymen, but they all had one thing in common: they were faithful to the Lord. When God's people start to decline spiritually, one of the first places it shows up is in their giving. Matthew 6:21 says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." The believer who is happy in the Lord and walking in his will has a gracious heart and wants to share with others. Okay, the prayer in 13:14, that's a prayer there because it starts out, "Remember me, O God." This is the first prayer since back in 6:14, and is the 7th prayer in this book of Nehemiah. There are 3 more such prayers in 13:22, 13:29, and 13:31, little short prayers. He was in the habit of talking to God as he served God. A good example for all of us. We need to be talking to God. He reminded God of his faithfulness and prayed that what he had done would not be blotted out. Nehemiah was not pleading for blessings on the basis of personal merit, because he knew that God's blessing comes only because of God's mercy. This prayer is similar to the one recorded in 5:19, where Nehemiah merely asked God to remember him and what he had done. He wanted his reward from God, not from men. If all we do is receive, then we become receivers or reservoirs, and the water can become stale and polluted. But if we both receive and give, we become like channels, and in blessing others, we bless ourselves. It is said that the world is full of 2 kinds of people: the givers and the takers. The takers eat well, but the givers sleep well. And then in verses 15 through 22, which I had read before, was about the Sabbath, the promises of the Sabbath. So when they had signed that covenant back in chapter 10, the Jews, they had promised not to do business with the Gentiles on the Sabbath day, back in 1031. But when Nehemiah came back, he found that the people not only doing business on the Sabbath, but they were doing their daily work and carrying unnecessary burdens. The Jewish merchants didn't want to lose the opportunity to make money from the Gentiles, and the Gentiles were quick to make a profit from their Jewish neighbors. The child of God must choose spiritual wealth rather than material wealth and claim the promise of Matthew 6:33, which is, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you." Let's see. In Psalm 119, so whoever wrote Psalm 119 made it clear that he chose God's word rather than money. King Saul made the wrong choice in 1 Samuel, and so did Achan in Joshua 7. Joshua 7. Nehemiah took 3 steps towards changing that situation. First, he rebuked the Jews who were working and selling on the Sabbath and made them stop. Then he rebuked the nobles for allowing business on the Sabbath day, reminding them that the nation's violation of the Sabbath was one cause for their captivity. Did they want to have more wrath come on the people? His third step was a very practical one. He ordered the city gates shut on the Sabbath day. The guards had been willing to open the gates to the Gentile merchants, possibly because they were bribed. So Nehemiah put some of his own servants on duty. He also ordered the Levites to set a good example on the Sabbath and minister to the people. So now in the closing here, 29 and 31, Nehemiah closes with two more prayers. 29, it says, "Remember me, O God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites." And 31, it says, "And I provided for the wood offering and appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O God, for good." So just little short prayers, but he wanted to be remembered by God. So he wanted the God that would remember him for his faithful service. His conscience was clear, for he knew he had done everything for the good of the people and the glory of God. There would probably be little appreciation from the people in spite of his sacrifices, but he knew God would reward him accordingly. During the French Revolution, a man was seen running down the street after a mob moving quickly into danger, and he was hollering, "Stop, stop." Somebody cried out, "Don't follow that mob." As the man continued to run, he called back, "I have to follow them. I am the leader." Nehemiah was certainly not that kind of leader. He wasn't afraid of danger. He was wise in his plans and careful in his decisions. And we can always use a leader like Nehemiah. We have a lot of rubbish to remove and rebuilding to accomplish before the world will believe that our Savior, or that our God is real and our message is worth believing. There are 12 qualities that made Nehemiah a successful leader. First was he knew that he was called of God. When everything else fails, the call of God will give you the strength and resolution you need to get the job done. First, Moses resisted the call of God, but then he came to realize that God's calling was the greatest assurance of success. Okay, I guess that one, whoops. Oh, I guess I was supposed to do that one way in the beginning. I missed that slide. Okay. All right, so Philippians 1:6, and I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. And then in 1 Thessalonians, he who calls you is faithful. He will surely do it. Knowing that God had called him was the secret of Jeremiah's perseverance when everything around him was falling apart and his own people were against him. The worker who doesn't have a divine calling to the work is like a house without a foundation or a ship without an anchor, unprepared for the storms of life. Nehemiah started with a burden for Jerusalem, but the burden was not the call. He wept over the sad conditions of the city back in Nehemiah 1:4, but his tears were not the call. It was as he prayed to God and sought divine help that he received a call to leave his relatively easy job. Remember, he was a cupbearer for the king in Persia, or Babylon. And to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, because he knew God called him. Nehemiah could approach the king and get help, and he could also enlist the help of the Jews in Jerusalem. Secondly, he depended on prayer. The book of Nehemiah starts and ends with prayer. And in between, Nehemiah often sends up quick prayers to heaven and asks for God's help. Nehemiah was the royal governor of the province with all the authority and wealth of the king behind him, but he depended solely on God to help him finish the work. Nehemiah faced a gigantic task, a task too big for him, but not too great for God. Do not pray for tasks equal to your powers. Pray for powers equal to your tasks. One mark of a true spiritual leader is their honest acknowledgement of their own inadequacy and their humble trust in the power of God. We have Nehemiah's many times brief, spontaneous prayers recorded in the book. But behind those prayers was a life of prayer as seen in chapter 1. He certainly had a disciplined prayer life, for these telegraphed prayers accomplish little if our hearts are not in tune with God. Most Christians never realize that the hours that leaders must spend in prayer in order to get the job done. Pray for great things, said evangelist R.A. Torrey. Expect great things, work for great things, but above all, pray. Nehemiah certainly followed that advice. The third item, I thought I was going to get further along today than I didn't. I think we'll stop here and we'll pick up with the third item next week, because it's 10:45. I do. Go ahead. I do.
I was gonna ask you another question to research.
Uh-oh. Okay.
What I wanna do here is try to do a quick connection between Genesis, Exodus, Kings, Ezekiel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Matthew. And we're studying Matthew, and we're studying Ezra, Nehemiah in your class. Some of us have been in the Genesis class previously. Sometimes these connections are important. If we look back in Genesis, the garden was where God first dwelt with man. And sin, of course, drove Adam east out of Eden, and then Cain went farther east. And then, of course, we talked about this before, that there's all these different things in the Old Testament about going east.
Right.
Farther east and farther east. But the garden
Okay?
God enters the tabernacle in Exodus, and that is the new place where God dwells with his people. All right, we see that in Exodus. When I was teaching Exodus, we didn't quite get to that chapter, but that's an important part where God actually puts the cloud over it and enters into that tabernacle. And then I believe he does the same thing in Solomon's temple later on. But it's important to note that in Ezekiel chapter 10, about 600 BC, about 150 or so years before what you're talking about, God's Spirit leaves the temple. So by the time you get to Ezra and Nehemiah, they're rebuilding the city, they're acting enthusiastically, but we are never told that God re-enters that temple. And I think the implication is that he did not. Okay, 150 years after he left, during the time you're talking about, he did not re-enter the temple. So, one more thing. I think that the people there were trying to be good, but they were still wanting in the sight of God. When does God actually re-enter the temple? That's an important question. Okay? I'll give you about 2 seconds. I'll give you the answer because I know we don't have much time. When did God re-enter the temple? It was when he
What?
was riding on a donkey, traveling from the east back going west from the Mount of Olives.
So when Jesus re-entered the city,
God re-entered the temple when Jesus entered, is something that Nate is going to be talking about here in just a couple of minutes. That is an important thing to see from Genesis all the way to Matthew of that progression. And of course, Jesus destroys the city, was what we're talking about in class right now, and the new temple, of course, is a spiritual and not physical,
right?
which is what God was pointing towards all along.
It's people like you that need to show us how all this gets tied together. You do a great job, Ted. You really do. But you're right. It's a complete story all the way through. I don't know. I'm going to.
We study Nehemiah in this class, we study Matthew in this class, we study Genesis in this class. But we're never taught, a lot of times, we're never taught those connections.
Right.
I think they're more important than the stories sometimes. Or more important than Jesus.
Right. I agree. Thank you so much. Anybody else before we, any comment? Okay, we'll see you next week.